Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Support Coordinator webinar. I'm Vicky Gray, and I'll be your host for today's session, proudly presented by Endeavour Foundation. This month, we're excited to delve into the topic of impairment notices and their impact on participant supports, with our guest presenter, Mary Ingerton from Support Coordination Academy. As we gather online with attendees joining us from across Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the significance of the lands we call home. If you'd like to honour the traditional custodians of the lands you're logging in from, feel free to share the name in the chat. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gubbi Gubbi people, traditional custodians of the land on which I'm hosting from today. In the spirit of reconciliation, Endeavour Foundation acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Now, before we dive in, just a quick heads up on housekeeping. Your microphones and cameras will stay off, but we'd love for you to join the conversation in the chat. If you have a question for Mary, drop it in the Q&A section and we'll get to those questions after the presentation. You'll also see a link to our privacy policy in the chat. If you have any questions about that, just let us know. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I want to highlight our past webinar recordings. They're packed with great insights, strategies and practical tips. You can catch up anytime on our YouTube channel, so just follow the link in the chat and start watching. Now, as mentioned earlier, during this webinar, we'll delve into the topic of impairment notices and their impact on participant supports. Our presenter today is Mary Ingerton from Support Coordination Academy. Shortly, Mary will be covering why impairment notices are being issued now and what they mean for NDIS participants, how these changes impact planning and NDIS funding use, and the link between impairment notices and the NDIS List of Supports. But before handing you over to Mary, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Shania Brennan. Shania is Endeavour Foundation's Business Improvement Specialist, leading a team of social workers and disability specialists who advocate for our clients. With qualifications in psychology, HR management and social work, plus 8 years in the community sector, she's passionate about empowering vulnerable people with choice and control. Over to you, Shania.
Thank you, Vicky, and hello, everyone. It is wonderful to be here with you all today. As Vicky mentioned, I work with Endeavour Foundation, leading team that advocate for people in this space and in the intake space. As you know, today we'll be unpacking impairment notices and their impact on participant support. And I'm here at how these changes may look like. So looking quickly at the present or the current without impairment notices. Service providers don't always know what disability or disabilities a person has met the NDIS access for. And this can pose some challenges in ensuring that appropriate support can be delivered, not only to meet an individual's functional support-related needs as well. There are also challenges around advocating with a participant to the NDIA to receive increased funding in any domain of their plan if we don't know what disabilities they met access for. When impairment notices are fully implemented, we might foresee that they'll provide clear information around how a participant met NDIS access and what disabilities are listed on their impairment notice. This will ensure that a service provider is not only meeting a participant's functional capacity support needs, but their other disability-related support needs as well. Being aware of what disabilities are listed on the participant's impairment notice also means that we have clarity on how to advocate for funding increases with the participant to the NDIA. An example of what we are starting to see more frequently in the outcome letters specifically is the NDIA making reference to disability-related support needs and not just functional capacity needs. So while we know that these often go hand in hand, that is, a participant's functional capacity is directly related to their disability, the outcome letters that I in particular have seen over the last couple of months are specifically calling out when supporting evidence does not categorically link to the disabilities the participant met NDIS access for. Impairment notices, we're hoping, will help us by specifying what these disabilities are for a participant and will enable us to ensure that all supporting evidence clearly links to their disabilities. Interestingly, we've also seen an update to the NDIS Act at the end of February that is now including references to the impairment notices, particularly in the reasonable and necessary criteria. So if you haven't already seen this, I would definitely encourage you to have a read. We are hopeful that the impairment notices will support us in bringing knowledge to ensure we are meeting participants' disability-related support needs holistically and ultimately provide the support for the participants to continue achieving their goals. I'm now going to hand over to Mary, who will take us through the rest of today's presentation. Thank you, Mary.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming today. I know that Shania had a bit of issues with the internet, so hopefully we are in Brisbane. So hopefully the internet will hold out and we won't have any more issues. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about impairment notices and their impact on participant supports. So basically, we're going to be looking at why they're being issued by the NDIS and the impact to NDIS participants, a support coordinator's role in supporting people to understand what this means, and how a participant's impairment relates to the NDIS list of supports, and just a bit of an overview or just an introduction of the other impending changes. Okay, so just to highlight, I talk about a participant quite often as a general term. So when I say this, I'm also referring to anyone who might be acting on behalf of the participant, say, for example, a nominee, a carer, a parent. So let's get started. Remember to put your questions in the chat or the Q, and they'll get transferred over to the Q&A, or put them into the Q&A directly, and happy to answer any questions at the end. Okay, let's go. Hopefully it's working properly. Okay, so impairment notices. So impairment notices were introduced with the changes to the NDIS legislation, which took effect from 3rd of October 2024. So currently all new participants to the NDIS will receive an access decision letter, which confirms how they met access criteria, including the disability requirements to gain access to the NDIS. So from the 1st of January, new participants will also receive clearer information about how they met the access criteria, including whether it's a disability or early intervention requirements, or both, and also which includes a notice of impairment. So impairment notices are a response to the NDIS review, which made recommendations around that the access criteria needs to be in impairment notices or in relation to how the disability impacts on that person. It's also in relation to participants' requests for greater clarity and transparency regarding the basis of how they met access. So this is a shift that moves away from focusing solely on a person's disability diagnosis and making assumptions about their NDIS support needs based on their disability diagnosis. Instead, it acknowledges that individuals with the same disability diagnosis living situation, and therefore they required tailored supports to meet the unique needs. So that's basically the major difference in what impairment notices are supposed to achieve. Okay. So how does the NDIS assess a person's impairment? So when the NDIS receive an access request form, they will assess the reduction or loss in a person's ability to do things across all life domains due to an impairment. So an impairment relates to a loss or damage to a person's body function. So how a person's body functions, their body structure, how the person thinks and learns. Okay, so there are 6 categories of impairment. So basically what the NDIS will look at is they will confirm that a person has a disability diagnosis, and then they, based on the evidence that's provided in that access request form, they will assess how that disability is related to an impairment, how that impact of that disability impacts on that person, basically. So the 6 categories of impairment. So intellectual impairments, such as how a person speaks and listens, reads and writes, problem solves, processes and remembers information. So an intellectual impairment could become apparent at an early age or during a child's development. So cognitive impairments relate to how a person thinks, learns new things, uses judgments to make decisions and pays attention. There are some similarities with an intellectual impairment, but cognitive impairments generally or may appear at a later stage or in life or after a sudden event or injury. Neurological impairments, so such as how a person's body's nervous system may function. So neurological impairments can happen when there is a change in the function of the nervous system, such as in a damage to the brain or spinal cord injury. Damage to these parts of the body may affect the way the nervous system basically processes information. Okay, sensory impairments, such as how a person sees or hears, but sensory impairments usually relate to hearing or vision loss, but may include all senses. Okay, physical impairments, such as the ability to move or control parts of our body. So physical impairments may affect a person's stamina or how quickly their body gets tired. Impairments related to a psychosocial disability. So this means that the person has reduced capacity to do daily activities and tasks due to their mental health. Okay, hold on a minute, my earplugs are popping out. Sorry, guys. Make sure you can hear me. Right, everybody hear me? All good? Great, thank you very much. Sorry about that. Okay, so psychosocial disability is the impairment for psychosocial disability. It basically means that the person has reduced capacity to do daily life activities and tasks due to the impact of their mental health. So when a child is under 6 with a developmental delay, the notice of impairment will state that the child has a developmental delay and will not include any of the other impairment categories. Because we know that with a child with a developmental delay, they're still getting assessments and having therapy and making a determination about whether their impairment or the disability will be likely to be permanent, but also they're still trying to determine what the diagnosis might be. So a person may have been born with an impairment, or an impairment could have been acquired due to an injury, accident, or a health condition. A person might have one impairment, or they might have one or more impairments. Okay. Hopefully that's making it a bit clearer. Okay. So what we're going to have a look at is the disability access requirements to understand how a notice of impairment fits into these criteria. And this is really, really important, especially if you're working with someone who already is on the scheme and you start working with them and you might notice that, say you might be working with someone who has an intellectual impairment and you start working with them and then you identify that there might be some psychosocial a disability impact going on as well. Okay, so this will become a lot clearer once we've talked about it. So to meet the disability access requirements, so for access to the NDIS, you've got to meet the age requirements and the residency requirements, and then there's disability requirements. So the disability access requirements, a person with disability must provide evidence that they meet all of this criteria, not just one, all of them. Okay. And I've broken it down to make it a bit clearer because it's quite complex, I suppose. So first of all, the person has to have a disability related to or regarded as being attributed to one or more impairments. Okay. So the impairment is permanent or likely to be permanent, meaning that the permanent is enduring and the person will require NDIS supports on an ongoing basis across their lifetime. So it's not an impairment that is just temporary or have a temporary impact. Okay. So a person's impairment may be like episodic in nature, however, it will still be permanent due to the overall impact over a person's daily life across their lifetime. So more relating to someone with a psychosocial disability. So an impairment is not considered likely to be permanent if there are known, available and appropriate evidence-based clinical, medical or other treatment options that are likely to remedy the impact of the impairment. So remedy or reduce the impact of the impairment. So I'll give you an example. Say a person receives a disability diagnosis of having epilepsy, which is related to a neurological impairment. So it's a way that their brain processes information. It impacts on their neurological impairment. So it's not likely to be considered as having a permanent impairment due to evidence-based medication or therapy that is able to manage and effectively reduce the impact of seizures occurring. So the long-term impact doesn't have a long-term impact because there's medication or therapy that might be able to reduce the impact. Hopefully that's a really good example. So the impact of their impairment has a substantially reduced functional capacity on one or more daily life activities. So these are things that we talk about that significantly reduce functional capacity domains. So the 6 domains haven't changed. So it includes an ability to move, mobility around a person's home and the community, to communicate effectively, to socialise, learn, undertake self-care or self-management tasks. So the person's impairment affects their ability to work, study or take part in social life. This part hasn't changed at all, and the person will likely need supports for their lifetime. So the majority of the NDIS criteria is exactly the same. It's really just about how the focus has really changed, but also how impairment notices fit into that criteria. Okay. How are we going for time? Really good. Good. Okay. So what is a notice of impairment? A notice of impairment informs a participant of the categories of impairment or impairments they have met in relation to the disability access requirements for the NDIS. Okay. A person's impairment will directly impact on and create barriers to accessing the supports that they need to complete daily activities, but also barriers to being able to participate in NDIS processes. So if you think about the participants if you're a support coordinator and you think about the participants that you're already working with, you might have a person with a disability diagnosis which relates to a cognitive impairment. So you will already see the barriers that they face in relation to being able to process and retain information, the way that they learn new things, which creates barriers in relation to being able to work or volunteer or study or access their community or participate in social life. So you're already seeing that. So that's giving you a direct link about how the disability diagnosis relates to an impairment, which creates barriers due to the reduced significant functional capacity. Okay, so hopefully this is all helping you to connect that all together. So the impact of a person's impairment directly relates to the disability-related supports that NDIS will fund on a participant's plan. So I'll give you an example about what I mean about that. So say a participant has a disability that relates to a cognitive impairment. The NDIS will not approve funded supports that relate to any other impairment. So say a person, so I'll give you an example. So say a person has a cognitive impairment, the NDIS will only approve funded supports for barriers that are due to the impact of that cognitive impairment, not a physical impairment or not a neurological impairment or intellectual impairment. So as a support coordinator, it's really, really, really important that we understand what is a disability diagnosis and what is a related impairment and what are the barriers that that person faces or experiences in relation to that impairment, because that will directly relate to the supports that the NDIS will fund. And it helps us as support coordinators to have these conversations with people about when supports are being requested, how does that relate to the impairment? How does that impact on you on a daily basis? Because that helps us to gather evidence to provide to the NDIS. Okay. So a person can apply for a change to the notice of impairment or add an additional impairment to their current registered impairment with the NDIS. This is referred to as a variation of an impairment notice. So to change or add an additional impairment, a person would need to provide evidence that the impairment meets the disability access requirements that we outlined earlier. So all of those stages that I took you through. So for example, say a person has a disability diagnosis of autism, which is related to a cognitive impairment. So say the person then had an accident and the person is also then diagnosed with a disability that relates to a physical impairment. So if the person then wants to receive supports from the NDIS in relation to that physical impairment, they would need to gather evidence to demonstrate how that disability, which relates to a physical impairment, meets the disability access criteria. And then the NDIS would consider both supports that relate to barriers created due to the cognitive impairment as well as the physical impairment. Hopefully that makes sense. So if a notice of impairment is varied, it doesn't mean that it changes the person's eligibility. And also if a person does not agree with a notice of impairment provided by the NDIS, they can request a review of the decision. So it is a reviewable decision. Okay. We're going quite well. So let's have a look at the support coordinator role. So support coordinators play a crucial role in helping NDIS participants navigate and participate in NDIS systems and processes, including making sure that they can access the supports that they need, to overcome those barriers due to the impact of their impairment. Okay, so the NDIS previously based their assessments of a participant's support needs on a participant's disability diagnosis. For example, two individual adults who have the same, disability diagnosis, say as autism, were often assumed to require similar types of support unless evidence was provided that they required different or additional supports. So this was the main reason why the NDIS review criticised the way that this was assessed around people's disability support needs, and is why they recommended it needs to relate to an impairment. So the shift towards impairment notices means the NDIS will now focus on how a person's impairment impacts on their daily life, as opposed to the disability diagnosis itself, recognising that not all people with the same disability diagnosis will require the same supports. So this is the whole idea behind impairment notices. So it's crucial that support coordinators have the right skills and knowledge to assist participants to articulate in evidence how their impairment impacts on their ability to complete everyday tasks and to have independence. So support coordinators need to have high skill levels in documenting and gathering evidence of complexity in a participant's situation, understanding how to assess and manage risk across a participant support network, and evidence of participants' complex support needs in the NDIS reporting. This is going to become more and more evident as impairment notices are rolled out. The NDIS are going to be coming straight back, especially with NDIS reporting, coming back to an impairment notice and going, well, this is the person's impairment. How do these supports relate to that? Where is the evidence? So a support coordinator is going to need to be able to ensure that participants can access the supports that they need to be safe and to achieve their life goals. Okay. There's a lot of coming through on the chat. Okay. Okay, there should be another slide on there and I'm not quite sure what's happened to it. That's okay. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about NDIS List of Supports. So the list of supports, most of you would have already seen it. It's been out for a while. There's new rules around it. There's not a lot of clarification, but there's 37 categories of goods and services that are able to be purchased with NDIS funding. So the whole purpose is the list of supports are a precursor to all the other changes that are going to happen in relation to the changes around the NDIS legislation, excuse me. So the NDIS states that these supports are non-disability related supports, meaning a participant of the NDIS requires these specific supports and services due to the impact of their impairment and their significantly reduced functional capacity, which creates barriers for that person to complete daily activities. So this is all language that support coordinators need to understand and use as part of the NDIS reporting. So the list of supports are precursors to the other NDIS processes, which will be implemented in the future. So I'm just going to highlight what some of these precursors are, and you can find a lot more information on the NDIS website. So you can go to the NDIS website under changes to the NDIS legislation, frequently asked questions. There's a lot more detail in there around that. And also DSS Engage, there's some good information on there as well. Okay, so the one that we're all hearing about at the moment is the planning approach. So the planning approach, there are tenders out at the moment in relation to assessment tools, to training for the new 1,000 assessors that are going to be employed by the NDIS and the platform for them to use. So basically what will happen is that for people coming through to the scheme, new people coming through to the scheme to start with, once a person has met the access criteria, they will have a support needs assessment. So this is a holistic assessment that is strength-based assessment, focusing on the person's support needs rather than their functional capacity. So it looks at the barriers that they face due to the related impairments. How does that impairment impact on that person? How is that unique to that person? How does it impact in their school life, their work life, their home life, wherever that person goes? So it's more of a holistic assessment as opposed to just having that 1 hour and a half meeting with a planner who's never really met that person before. So the supports needs assessment will then inform the person's budget or funding level, and the participant will have increased flexibility in how they can utilise that funding. So the budgets will move from the current restrictive core capacity and capital to flexible and non-flexible. So there'll be more flexibility about how that person can use that funding. So if you want more information about the impending changes, please go to the NDIS website. I will send more information, or I'll ask Endeavour to put it into the chat. Okay, so I'm going to put it into the chat. Here we go. Okay, chat's not coming up. Okay, I'm going to type it in here for you. ndis.gov.au changes NDIS legislation. Okay, if you Google that, you will be able to get to the page that has a lot more information about the NDIS legislations. Okay. Now we've allowed a lot of time because I was assuming that there were going to be a lot of questions. Okay, let's get to the Q&A session. Okay, so I'm just going to bring this up because hopefully it opens properly. My Q&A isn't opening. Okay. No, it's not actually a link. What I would do is just copy and paste it and actually put it into Google and then just search it. That will help you actually find it. Yeah. Okay. Look, I'm really sorry, guys. My Q&A isn't loading. I'm just going to try it again. Ah, here we go. It's loaded. Okay. So I'm just going to start from the top. Do you know what the age is when the impairment should appear for ECEI clients on PACE? I have several ECEI clients where their paid pediatric official diagnosis was issued and submitted to NDIS 2 years ago, and yet they are still shown as global development delay. Okay, so impairment notices will only be issued to people who are new to the scheme to start with. They actually then want to review the process, and then later on they will start working through people once they get a reassessment, issuing those notices. Okay, so it won't actually, how it will look on PACE, wouldn't have a clue. I find PACE, and I've never really had a lot to do with PACE, so you would need to ask the NDIA that question about what that would look on PACE, how the impairment notice will look. And I'm not quite sure how that's going to actually look. That's a really good question. I would be sending that to the NDIS. So what happens if the assessment doesn't meet participants' needs? How do participants navigate a reassessment? So the new needs assessments are a way off. They're still figuring out the assessment tools, how they're going to work. They've still got to employ staff. Like, they are a way off. They are hoping to have them up and running by the end of the year. So there will be a lot more information around what those assessments will look like. And I suppose from my perspective, I think an holistic strength-based needs assessment has got to be better than what currently happens. It's actually looking at the person as a whole, not just focusing on a diagnosis. So to me, it's going to be a good thing. We still need to have a look to see what it's going to look like. But of course, any decisions made by the NDIS will be reviewable decisions. Okay. Support needs assessments. Are you talking about NDIS or navigators? Not talking about navigators at all. This has nothing to do with navigators. These are the way that the NDIS plans. So when you think about the current system, someone gets access criteria, they then get sent out the access letter, and then they get organised to have a planning meeting with a planner for an hour, hour and a half, virtually, however that happens. That whole planning meeting, that is the planning process that I'm talking about. That is a process that will change. That is a process that they are having consultation about. They are gathering the tools. They are gathering the assessments. They want to trial it with new people first, learn from what they've got. This is what they're all talking about, and then they'll go further. There's a lot more information on the NDIS website. So we have heard nothing about the navigator roles at all. So we don't even know what that's going to look like. Okay. What about existing NDIS participants? Do you know when they might receive NDIS payments? No, I don't. There's no specific time frame of when that's going to be rolled out, but there's more information. If you go to that page that I was referring to, there's more information being added to that page all the time. How many times can someone have the assessment? Sorry, I'm not quite sure what you mean. So the assessment is the planning process. It's about assessing that person's needs and about what their supports needs look like. How does their employment impact them on a daily basis? So that whole planning process. Okay. What type of evidence will they look at? Who will assess the evidence? Who will pay for this evidence if the functional capacity assessment is still the leading requirement? Okay, so the intention is that people will no longer need to go and get functional capacity assessments. So people will get evidence around their disability and how that impacts on their disability. But in relation to this assessment, the assessment will be done by the NDIS. So people will no longer have to go and get functional capacity assessments. That holistic strength-based assessment will then be determined around how does their impairment impact on them? How does it reduce their functional capacity on a daily basis in all aspects of their life? Okay. The biggest concern is that the NDIS doesn't read the reports currently, so are they going to continue to be arbitrarily deciding if the impacts report? Okay. So the people that were doing the support needs assessments, and there's a lot of information, there's a lot of process, there's a lot of things that need to happen before they actually get rolled out. And again, it's going to be a trial with new participants first. Will be staff employed by the NDIS, specifically social workers, OTs, allied health therapists, or people who have people with disability, people who have experience in doing these assessments. Okay. Will the evidence need to be different to what we're already getting if these assessments report? I think I've already done that. These are assessments that will be done by the NDIS. Okay, who is paying for the additional evidence and time to gather this evidence? Okay, hopefully I'm making sense around so thinking about the support needs assessments as part of the NDIS planning process. Yeah, how that will impact on a person with disability who are currently, so eventually when someone gets, my understanding is, so say you're working with someone who's currently a participant and they might need a reassessment of their needs due to a significant change in their support needs and their life situation. They will eventually, once the system is up and running, it's going to take a long time, those assessors will eventually do that holistic assessment as well. So how would that impact on a person with disability currently, and what support and what reports would you need to provide? Well, you're still going to need to gather evidence around the changes to that person's support needs. And so maybe a person has a psychosocial disability and they've had a reduction in their functional capacity. How does that relate to their ability? How does that reduce capacity on a daily basis? So you might get a psychologist that's been working with that person that talks about the impact of their disability. So it's not clear about how they will correlate to the evidence that we've already supported, but we already gather. But for me, as a support coordinator, we'll still need to gather evidence about the change in that person's situation and how that impacts on them. Okay. The assessments will be, the support needs assessments will more be around the planning processes. So you think about the planning processes that the NDIS already do. Planning meetings right at the beginning and planning when they go for a review, which is now called a reassessment of a person's needs. Okay. Can these impairment notices be requested for all current clients? No, sorry. Thank you for saying that. Already answered. Who is assessing the impairments from the NDIS? Already answered that. Okay. Recently told by a planner that there are no secondary disability recorded any longer. If true, how does another impairment get added? I think I answered that question during the webinar. So it's so basically a person to meet the disability access criteria has to be a disability diagnosis. That there needs to be evidence about how that disability is related to an impairment. So someone can have one disability diagnosis and a number of impairments, or that something else might happen and they might get another disability diagnosis, and so they would need to go through the disability access criteria. But again, if someone has a disability diagnosis and they have a related impairment, but there is something else that happens in their life, or there's additional evidence in relation to the impact of another impairment, then they would need to evidence how that secondary impairment or an additional disability and impairment meets that disability access criteria to get added to that person's profile. Pretty similar to what happens now. Okay, so if we support a participant to obtain evidence, how can we convince the planners to actually read and understand the evidence? Okay, really good question, actually. If you're a support coordinator and you are sending evidence into the NDIS, how you can convince a planner to actually read and understand the evidence is through your support coordination reporting. When you're doing your support coordination reporting, you need to understand the language that you need to use. You need to understand the evidence that you need to gather. You need to know how to write a report to the audience who's going to read it. So you're literally summarizing and pulling everything together from the evidence that you're providing, and you're putting in one report using the language that they use in a clear and succinct way. That's how you do it. Okay. So that if you're providing a report from a notee that is 26 pages long, you've summarized the most important parts that the NDIS Centre need to be putting their eyes on within your NDIS report. Okay. Where early intervention is the eligibility, does the proof need to be broken down for each criteria? The early intervention is going to slow the progress of Parkinson's disease. Early intervention criteria, it's so if you go and have a look at the operational guidelines, there's information in there to the updated operational guidelines for access to the NDIS that talks about early intervention. Okay. Are you saying that a physical impairment and a cognitive impairment cannot be connected without no, not at all. Not at all. What I'm saying is a person's disability diagnosis relates to an impairment. There could be a number of impairments, or there could be one impairment. It relates to how that disability impacts on that person and creates barriers for that person. Will relate to an impairment or a number of impairments, is what I'm saying. Okay, how do we know what information has been provided historically in relation to impairments? Okay, or to the access criteria, which would relate to an impairment. So eventually all people will be issued impairment notices so that it's a lot clearer and they've got more clarity around how they get access to the NDIS. That's the intention, starting with new people accessing the scheme, later on everybody else. So how can you get that historical information? From the people who put the access request in. But also you can request that information, the person with a disability can request that information from the NDIS, and you can do that through the NDIS website. Okay. Can participant use existing NDIS funding to pay for proof of additional impairments, or will they have to fund these privately? Okay, so it depends on what funding that they have available. When I've worked with participants and they have a significant change in their support needs, so that if they have a support plan, if they have an NDIS plan, and I'm working with that person in relation to a disability diagnosis and related impairment and support needs, if it then becomes evident that they have additional disability related support needs, then I have access to that funding to get a functional capacity assessment, because the previous functional capacity assessment didn't pick up on all of the impact of their disability, which relates to the impairments. So if you're finding that you're working with a participant and it's not evident that they have additional impairments that haven't been noted by the NDIS or have become evident when you've been working with them due to an accident or a reduction into the functional capacity, then what support coordinators are required to do is support that person to get an updated functional capacity assessment, which then would be looking at the disability diagnosis and the related impairments. Okay. Allied health. Yep, there you go. Well done, Charmaine. I've been asking current allied health practitioners to include disability and associated impairments to their reports. Well done. Brilliant. How many impairments will NDIS? Okay, I've already answered that question. Do you know if there is a plan ahead for in-PACE, if in request for service section where it says their primary diagnosis, if there is a forward, hold on a minute, forward plan to add a section, I don't know, sorry. I don't know how the impairment notices will impact on PACE. That's a question that needs to be asked to the NDIS because it's their system. Define effect. Does this mean without supports? Okay. I'm not quite sure what that question means. If you think a person has a disability diagnosis, and due to that, and how that disability impacts on that person is how that impairment, how they will assess how that relates to an impairment. So it'd say disability diagnosis, relates to an impairment, and the impairment relates to how that disability impacts on that person is the impairment, and the impairment, if you think about an impairment, then creates barriers. So how does that impairment create barriers to being able to access the supports that they need? That relates to the reduced functional capacity. So that's how the NDIS assess the disability access criteria. Hopefully that makes sense. What about epilepsy that has been proven to not be able to be cured, nor symptomatic control? Absolutely. You would need to talk to the NDIS about that. I haven't really heard of anyone that's been able to get access to the scheme with an epilepsy diagnosis. So they would need to provide evidence that they have tried all the medication over a long period of time, that the medication has not worked, or why it has not worked, that they have tried all other therapy, anything else that could be worked by their specialist. The specialist would need to provide evidence of that, and the NDIS would need to then assess that the impact of their epilepsy, which is a disability, is likely to be lifelong, and they would require supports from the NDIS over the period of their life. So again, going back to the disability criteria, is the impairment notice different to an access decision letter? An impairment notice will be included within the access decision letter. Okay. Why does there seem to be no letters giving us information about their impairments with access decisions? Okay, so from 1st of January, new people gaining access to the scheme, that's where the impairment notices are supposed to be included within those access letters, just for new people, not current people on the scheme. Are the NDIS refusing access to certain disabilities? Again, it's not about a disability, it's about providing evidence of meeting that disability access criteria. There's no intention to make a list of disabilities that they're not going to access. It's about meeting the criteria. If you go through all those 5 stages, how do you provide evidence to meet each of those criteria? How do we get access to a copy of the access letter? For my brand new NDIS precedents from 1st of January onwards, I just keep being told it's not information that can be shared as it's stored in non-PACE systems. There you go. Or they can't work out how to see if the impairment notice has been generated. You got to love NDIS systems. The person with a disability should have received an access letter with a notice of impairment. If they haven't, contacting the call centre to request a copy of the notice. Again, there's a place within the NDIS website, and I think it's under participants, to request this information directly from the NDIS. Okay, show one comment. There you go. Look for participant information access requests on the NDIS website. You can easily apply online. So you can request decisions around access, planning, all those things. Okay. What is the difference between disability and early intervention requirements? Again, go and look at the operational guidelines, access to the NDIS, and they're under NDIS website under About, NDIS operational guidelines. For those that were rolled into the NDIS as they were already receiving government services when the NDIS started, how do they know what they're, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean. Okay, so you're really talking about people that were already accessing NDIS services and they were automatically gained access to the NDIS. How do they know what their impairments are within the NDIS? So eventually, everybody will receive an impairment notice. So again, they've only just started. They're starting with people with new access to the scheme. Eventually, everybody will get an impairment notice. Okay, I'm going to go to new post, and I'm just keeping a track of the time. It's 10:02. Yeah, well done. Okay, so Coral's got some comments around epilepsy. The reason that I mentioned epilepsy, and I hope that that's not offensive to anyone, is my daughter has epilepsy. So I know the impact of what epilepsy has, and she could get no support whatsoever through the NDIS. So I understand it from a personal experience. Okay, as a behaviour support practitioner, how do I ensure that the key information is pulled out of the report and put into a support coordination report? If this is the best way to ensure the report's essential information can be identified and included in the report, How should we adapt behaviour support plans to support coordinators to successfully advocate? How will we know when an impairment notice has been issued to a participant if the participant is not able to reliably receive and advise their support network of this? So at the moment, if you are getting a functional capacity assessment or anything, if you currently look at, you're working with the participants that you support, have a think about it. To me, it's pretty evident. So if you've had a functional capacity assessment done, or you've had any assessments that look at the functional impact of that person's disability. So if you look at the disability diagnosis and then you talk to the person around, so how does this disability impact on you on a daily basis? What are the barriers that you face? What are the things that you find really, really challenging? And relate that to a category of impairment that is likely going to be their notice of impairment. Okay, so as a psychologist or an occupational therapist or a behaviour support practitioner, understanding the disability, understanding how that impairment impacts on that person on a daily basis, and then looking at the different categories, you'll clearly be able to see how they relate to an impairment. So without being issued that notice of impairment, you can already see the impairment and how that person impacts on them. Okay, in relation to behaviour support practitioner, it's not your responsibility to pull out information to tell a support coordinator how to put that into a report. It's a support coordinator's responsibility. So as a behaviour support practitioner, it's just being very, very clear around the behaviour support, how it impacts on a person, all that kind of thing. I'm really talking about support coordinator reports more in relation to a participant support needs and looking at the evidence that you've gathered around the impact of that impairment, how it reduces their functional capacity, how it creates barriers on a daily basis, pulling that information out and understanding how it impacts on that personal influences and situational factors and how that creates barriers for the person. So again, we have training around this under Professional Skills Support Coordination Academy. Go and have a look at it. But if you want to know more about Samantha, if you want to email me directly, happy to have a conversation about it. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we've only got 8 minutes left, so this will be the last one. Other than the 5 criteria to meet access, what sections of the early intervention legislation also has to be considered to meet access? Again, go back to the access criteria, operational guidelines. Okay. Here we go, going to be taken back. Sorry about that, guys. I will get Vicky to send me any more questions that you have that haven't been answered so I can respond to them. Hopefully this has been helpful. Thanks very much, guys. Have a great day.
Thank you, Mary. That was a fantastic and engaging presentation. Lots and lots of information coming through there with regards to all the questions that you've asked. Like Mary said, we will gather any questions that we haven't answered and we'll get that back. We'll get Mary to have a look at that for you, and obviously we'll get some of that over to you in the next couple of days. So tomorrow you'll receive an email with today's recorded session, plus the PDF of the presentation. A lot of people were asking about that, so yeah, you will get that, and it will be the updated one. I know Mary mentioned that there was a slide missing, so I'll make sure we've got that in there. We'll also add a link to our survey. We really, really love your feedback because it really helps us to keep improving our webinars. So please keep an eye out in your inbox tomorrow. We'd love to invite you along to our next webinar in April, which is about NDIS home and living options, a guide for support coordinators. And that's on Tuesday, the 8th of April, at the same time of 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. AEST, or whatever time zone you're in. In the meantime, we're also inviting you to explore 2 of our accessible SIL homes in Queensland's Moreton Bay region. Our team will be on site in Launton and Petre to answer questions and help you determine if SIL is the right fit for your clients. If you check out the link in the chat, we've just popped the flyer in there with dates and further information about that. And if you've missed it earlier, we've just shared the link again to all our support coordinator webinar recordings on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe so that you'll always know when our new videos are available. And for those who want to stay informed and better support their clients, we've also shared the link to our fortnightly Care Connect newsletter in the chat. You sign up for valuable updates, insights and resources, and that gets delivered straight to your inbox every fortnight. On behalf of Endeavour Foundation, thank you so much for joining today's webinar. We're wishing you all a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you all again next month in April. Thank you so much.
Hello everybody, welcome to our Learning and Lifestyle Hub. This is where we make learning fun.
Hi, my name is Andy. I love making Mexican. One day I'm going on MasterChef.
Hi, I'm Grace. I live independently with support when I need it. I live my life my way.
Hi, that's Kevin. I live here. I like to go to a gym.
Hi, I'm Tisha. I love my life. I got the garbage shop. The high, the good.
I'm Clayton and I love rugby league. I'm normally kicking the footy around in my backyard. This is my home. This is my life. This is my community.
Hi, my name's Jeremy. My daughter's 3 years old. My daughter's proud that I come to work.
I like to go into work.
Hi, I'm Maddie and I work for the Endeavour Foundation. I come to work with a big smile on my face every day.
Love to work here because that's my new family.